positive approach. And more specifically, we will go through a little bit of background and context. It's important that we're all on the same page for understanding why it's important, the nature positive approach. What does it cover? What are the main issues and problems that it tries to address? And what are the current voluntary and regulatory frameworks for implementing the nature positive approach? And that's going to be a very big picture background and context. Then we're going to drill down more on the nature positive approach, mostly for companies, for the private sector. So what does it involve? How do you get started? What are the key steps? We will also share our Etifor's approach, so our Lucas approach that we've developed to help companies in their nature positive journey. And then we'll go through some high level conclusions and takeaways. If you have any questions, feel free to interrupt me. So the first thing, maybe the most important thing to understand is what is nature positive trying to address? And in order to do that, you need to understand what are the major Earth systems and the planetary boundaries concept. Don't worry about the graphic on the right. I'm going to walk everyone through it, but it's pretty straightforward. So the basic concept is we depend on stable, secure, and self-regulating Earth systems. I think that everybody's pretty familiar with climate change and atmospheric conditions. That we need air to breathe, obviously. We need stable climate systems, dependable rainfall patterns, etc. But that's not all that we depend on. So there are also water cycles, nutrient cycles, biogeochemical flows and chemical balances, food webs, and biosphere and ecosystem integrity that are fundamental to our health and well-being on this planet. We depend on them in a myriad of ways to live our lives, for the food we eat, the water we drink, the resources that we use for our homes and everything else. So that's the idea. And the Stockholm Resilience Center has published this, divided this into the systems that you see on the right. So we have biosphere integrity, climate change is an important one, freshwater, ocean acidification, etc. Now, to a certain extent, these Earth systems, they self-regulate and they can assimilate our impacts, right? Everything that we do has an impact to an extent. There's no such thing as zero impact, maybe net zero, but no such thing as gross zero impact. And that's okay. You know, that's just us living in the world. Every other animal, every other species, every other living thing on this planet also has an impact, needs resources and takes resources, and also gives resources, right? But beyond a certain threshold, these systems start to break down. And on the right in this graph, what you can see is that we've defined what's called the safe operating space for each of these Earth systems. And as long as our what we take, our consumption, our impacts are within these safe operating boundaries, the system can self-regulate. It's okay. But when we start to exceed these boundaries, the systems are compromised and they start to break down, and they're unable to self-regulate, and we bear the cost of that. I hope that that's clear. We have already exceeded 6 of the 9 planetary boundaries. So climate change is a popular topic. It's an important one, but we're also talking about freshwater change and freshwater resources, biosphere integrity, land system use and change, biogeochemical flows. So this is like pollution and nutrient loading, acidification, eutrophication of our rivers, as well as novel entities. Novel entities basically means the introduction of materials that are non-native or non-natural. Plastic is a good example, aluminum, concrete, etc., that we've introduced these non-natural materials into the environment. And that's a problem. Let me put it as clearly as I can. Climate change is a critical system that we need to address, but the others are just as critical. And if we do everything in our power to reduce our impacts and reach net zero for climate, and we keep the temperature increase to 1.5 Celsius increase of global warming, that's great. But if we don't have clean water to drink, if we don't have secure and self-regulating ecosystems to draw resources from, if we have polluted all of our rivers, then it doesn't matter what the temperature is outside. So I hope that that point is relatively clear and well taken. So how are we doing? I'll briefly walk us through some of the problems. So maybe it's important to understand this idea of the Anthropocene and welcome everyone to it. So the Anthropocene means that our impacts, our economic activities in particular, are great enough that we have started to have a direct and profound influence on each of these Earth systems. We are leaving an impact that will be measurable in geologic time. So we're not talking about impacts that last 10 years, 20 years, 50 years, 100 years, 1,000 years. We're talking about being able to see the impacts of what we've done to the planet in millions of years from now, the same way that we're able to trace back and know what happened when the dinosaurs were here, for example. How? Well, for global water cycle disruptions, there are some issues. 4 billion people face severe water scarcity for at least 1 month per year. 2 out of every 3 rivers on the planet are fragmented by dams and reservoirs. And we see about $82 billion per year in flood damages. Flood damages actually constitute the highest natural risk when we look at what is the cost of compromising these systems. For land use, almost 75% of the Earth's surface has been altered, changed, or influenced by human activity in the last 1,000 years. And about a third of that, up to half of that change, has occurred only since 1960. So that means that an area about twice the size of Germany has been changed or impacted beyond its natural state every year since 1960. And we still see about 10 million hectares of forest loss per year since 2000. For biosphere integrity, we've seen a 69% decline in terrestrial populations. And by that, I don't even necessarily mean extinction rates. I mean, if you just, in terms of biomass, the populations have severely declined, even among non-threatened species. And we've seen an even greater decline in freshwater populations. So there's a lot of problems. What is driving this nature loss? So if you look at IPCC, which handles climate change, and IPBES, which is the Intergovernmental Panel on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services, let's say it's the biodiversity and ecosystem services equivalent of the IPCC, they've identified 5 main pressures on nature loss: land, water, or sea use change, resource exploitation, climate change, again, it's important, pollution, and invasive species and other types of impacts. The impacts from these pressures depend on the scale and intensity of the economic activity, as well as the local state of nature, so the local integrity or ability to self-regulate. It's very site-specific and location-based. Now, how do we respond? And what is the difference? How does nature positive relate to the climate carbon neutral or net zero approaches that everyone has seen in the other presentations by my colleagues Valerio and Lucho? At a very high level, we can refer to the global goals for nature. So the global goals for nature are the nature positive equivalent to the 1.5 C global warming target in the Paris Climate Accord. And it's relatively straightforward. The idea is no loss of nature or zero net loss of nature from 2020, net positive impacts on nature by 2030, and full recovery by 2050. So these are the benchmarks and the targets that all of this, the global biodiversity framework, voluntary initiatives like the science-based targets for nature that I'll get into, they are coalescing, let's say, and setting targets based on these global goals for nature. And what we've seen is that there's been an explosion of voluntary initiatives and emerging regulatory mechanisms to help encourage both public bodies and the private sector align with these goals. So in the voluntary space, there are financing mechanisms and performance standards like the International Finance Corporation's Performance Standard 6 for biodiversity and ecosystem services. Maybe some people in the room are familiar with the recently released science-based targets for nature, which is the nature positive equivalent of science-based targets for climate, as well as the Task Force for Nature-related Financial Disclosures. There are reporting and disclosure frameworks like the Standard & Poor's CSA, other sustainability frameworks, EcoVadis, the Global Reporting Initiative. And then on the regulatory or let's say the bilateral, multilateral, and legal side, we have from last year, the Kunming-Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework, as well as required disclosures under the EU's Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive, the Net Zero Climate Law, Nature Restoration Law, the EU Deforestation Free Regulation. And the important thing is this: governments, financial institutions, insurance carriers, and regulators, creditors, investors are putting more pressure on the private sector for integrating nature-related risk into business operations and for demonstrating that you're putting nature at the heart of your decision-making. These are growing in scale, and I see this a lot with the clients that I work with, right? So how do companies respond to that, or how should they respond? It's important to recognize that these approaches are still being standardized. So a lot of standards and frameworks that I was referring to before are under development and will be released soon. But I think that we can sketch out at a high level the most important steps. So the first is that companies need to assess their material impacts and dependencies on nature for each of the 5 pressure categories that I described before. And that needs to be done for your direct operations and your supply chain. This is really important. So if you remember from Valerio's topic on scopes 1, 2, and 3, this is also being transported and ported over to the nature positive approach. And the principle is basically that responsibility for the pressures that are in your sector are shared across the supply chain. The level of responsibility depends on where you are in the supply chain, but it's expected that you engage with the pressures that you create upstream through the demand for products or services. Once you've assessed them, you prioritize the most important ESG issues based on the materiality, the importance to your business, as well as importance to stakeholders. These stakeholders could be internal, your executives board, different business units, and also external, business to business partners, your customers and clients, major investors, things like that. And once you've identified what your material risks are, you've prioritized them so you know which ones need to be addressed first, then you can set a baseline and commit to science-based targets to address them. And then when you're implementing the idea, when you're trying to reach your commitment and hit your targets, the idea is that you integrate a mitigation hierarchy aligned approach for managing your nature-related risks and opportunities. I'm going to go through each of those in a little bit more detail now, but that's a high-level overview of where we are today and what's being expected of companies today for implementing a nature-positive approach. So materiality and assessing your materiality. The key thing to remember, and I wish I had more time to explain this because it's a very interesting topic, but the key thing to understand is that your materiality, it will vary by sector and economic activities. So no 2 companies and no 2 sectors have the same risks and opportunities. And that means that the prioritization and the targets should not be the same between companies. It's not like setting a climate target where everybody knows to hit net zero by 2050. For some companies, you'll need to prioritize, let's say, water consumption Other companies, it might be pollutant loading is your most material impact. Other companies, it will be your greenhouse gas emissions, and others will be land use change and land use impacts. This also varies upstream depending on what sort of products you need, how much they've been aggregated, how visible and transparent is your supply chain, et cetera. And so I hope that everyone can see the schematic that I've put up here, but basically what this shows is for different sectors, consumer discretionary, staples, industrials, energy, and for different sub-industries within these sectors, you can see the variance in materiality in the direct operations, which is that little circle in the middle, roughly scaled from 1 to 5, and also upstream and downstream, right? So computer and electronics have different material impacts on water use or terrestrial ecosystem use or solid waste and pollutants than does food retail or highway transportation or oil and gas exploration. And it's really important that companies understand at a sectoral level. So in the sub-industry or sector that you're operating in, what are the material impacts? And then you drill down and you refine it to your specific activities, also based on the maturity of your sustainability plan. Once you've identified at quite a high level what your material impacts are, you need to prioritize them. When we're talking about nature positive and we're talking about investing in a nature positive future, one way to think about it is it's a capital allocation problem. And when you're deciding where to allocate your company's capital to reach these commitments or demonstrate a positive impact, it has to obviously be done through a prioritization process. So on the right here, what you can see is a materiality matrix. On the x-axis, you see the impact on the business. So what kind of risk these different ESG issues like women's rights, economic inclusion, employee well-being, deforestation, sourcing, water consumption. What kind of risks do these pose to the company, to the continuity of your enterprise? And those risks there are different ways to assess them, different types of transmission channels. Does it create raw material price volatility, supply chain disruptions, reputational risk, reliability risk, et cetera? And that is how the company evaluates for themselves, how do these different issues impact our business? On the y-axis, you see the importance of stakeholders. So it's not just enough for you to self-report your material impacts. It's also very much co-determined by the perception of your key external stakeholders, your investors, your business-to-business partners, your consumers, and other major stakeholders that you're engaging with. How do they see the risks to your company on nature and other ESG issues? And so putting together this kind of prioritization matrix allows an organization to optimize their activities and how much they invest in different ESG related initiatives and where to start on the nature positive journey. Based on your materiality screening and the prioritization that's conducted in this matrix that I just showed you, then companies can decide to set commitments and establish targets. On the right, what you see is this is a climate and nature commitment. And there are some key components of a strong commitment and target setting that need to be addressed. So the first one is that you'll see that it's not just a climate commitment of net zero carbon emissions. It's a basket of targets and commitments that are adapted to your key material issues. So for this organization, the main issues that they needed to address were water consumption, air and water pollution, operational waste, and engaging with a circular economy approach, and biodiversity and land use impacts. And you can see also that within these goals and commitments, there are different targets that are meant to address each of them. So for example, at the very bottom, you see for biodiversity that there are a basket of targets on zero deforestation commitments, transparency in the supply chain, biodiversity management plans for sites, and investments in conservation or restoration efforts. All of those things need to be addressed in order to demonstrate a net positive impact on biodiversity. So that's one, is that it's typically not going to be one target, or it's not going to be as easy as saying we have one goal or one commitment. It's a bundle that are adapted to your material issues. These are aligned with global targets and initiatives like the Global Biodiversity Framework. Each of these goals has time-bound, geographically specific, and science-based targets that are in line with these global initiatives. And each target includes a key performance indicator or KPI for demonstrating progress. Now, being able to set a metric or a KPI for demonstrating progress is really important, both for disclosures to regulatory bodies and to investors. I wish I had a little bit more time to make the business case for going nature positive, but if you would like to access green finance, sustainability linked bonds that are related to your environmental performance, you will need a metric or a KPI to show investors that you are meeting the terms of that commitment. So that's really important that all of these are in place for a very strong commitment. Once you've set the commitment, you have to do something, right? And make your investment a reality. Excuse me. And here, the best practice, and really this, I think that this really holds true whether we're talking about climate targets, biodiversity, water, any of these related targets. We followed the mitigation hierarchy approach. And the mitigation hierarchy is a way to prioritize how you implement the activities to reach your net positive or no net loss commitment. And the first is that you measure your impact. Obviously, you need a baseline. Then you set targets that are ambitious, but also feasible and science-based. And then you avoid whatever impacts you can. And there are different ways to implement that. It depends on the sector or activity, but it could be this is typically at the site planning stage, right? Or an acquisition stage or development phase. So choosing carefully where you plan your sites, where you acquire new businesses, where you engage in sustainable development to reduce your impacts on biodiversity, water consumption, etc. It could also be product substitution, so switching from, say, a concrete-based to a wood-based or renewable biomaterial-based product. But the point is that should be the first, is that you don't create a negative impact in the first place. Then you try to minimize or reduce what you can't avoid. And so this could be, for example, reducing your emissions intensity or your water consumption intensity. So you say we have to engage in these actions for our business to be viable. But we will streamline, say, our manufacturing process to produce the same amount, but use less water or less emissions, as an example. Then whatever you can't avoid or reduce, you restore the direct or proximate negative impacts right around your site. So it's really important, especially when we're talking about nature positive, where water and biodiversity, these impacts are very location specific. They can't be compensated with a project across the world. So engaging in your community, in your watershed, in your ecosystem to restore what you can't avoid or reduce. And finally, whatever you cannot avoid, reduce, or restore, we call them your residual impacts. You can explore compensation or offsetting projects in order to reach your no net loss or net gain. So this is the mitigation hierarchy. It's really important to keep in mind, and it's a way to embed decision making at different parts of your business unit. So avoidance and reduction often happens at the procurement, construction, or manufacturing phase, whereas restoration is more about end of life and decommissioning, and compensation is often handled by ESG parts of companies. So for project scouting and working with consultants like Etifor. So when you're implementing your actions, investors, companies, they want to see that you are following this type of approach instead of skipping straight to compensation. This is one of the last slides, and I'll just briefly go through it. So Etifor has developed what we call our Lucas approach for helping companies reach their nature positive or even develop their nature positive journey. I'm not going to go through all of these different activities, but at a very high level, the Lucas approach is 5 main steps. First is you look at your stakeholders, at your supply chain, and where your business activities intersect with nature. So where are they located? Then you understand the impacts and dependencies on nature in your business operations, and you evaluate the associated risks and opportunities that you have for managing these impacts. This generates the materiality assessment. So it's a way for you, this is that the assess and prioritize phase that I was describing earlier. Then you, as I covered before, you commit to a nature positive approach, you set these specific and time-bound targets, the KPIs, et cetera. And then you have the act phase, where you act using the mitigation hierarchy to prioritize your approach and the activities you engage in. And finally, once you've covered all of these aspects, you share the results on a regular basis with your stakeholders. This is green marketing, this is ESG disclosures, this is applying for green and sustainability linked bonds. Once you've gone through the look, understand, commit, and started acting, then we can talk about how to share that with the broader, with your stakeholders. This is what we've done to help put together to help companies navigate this sort of strange, sort of new, still emerging sustainability space. Okay, that was a real crash course, but I have some conclusions and key takeaways that I hope everyone can bring with them as they explore this further. The first thing to understand and really to hammer home is that 100% of the economy, every business operation and activity is 100% dependent on nature. Everything. The table that your laptop rests on, the laptop itself that you're viewing this presentation with, the water that you're drinking or coffee that you may be drinking at the end of this long day, the cup that holds it, all of it, in a very reductive sense, was either mined or mined out of the ground or harvested out of the soil at some point in the supply chain that brought this product to you. That's really important. None of us are disconnected or not dependent on these natural systems. The problem is understanding if you're not so closely connected to nature, right? If you're not a mining company or an agricultural or forest company, understanding what are your hidden dependencies on nature that you may not even realize in your supply chain. And so this is a key thing to understand. Next is, what is nature positive? And what it simply means is you assess nature-related impacts and dependencies, you manage corresponding risks and opportunities, and you embed nature into your business decision-making. The third, and this is a hard one, I think, for a lot of companies to get, is that the responsibility for these impacts is shared across the supply chain. It's not sufficient for you to just cover your direct operations. Investors, regulatory bodies want to see that you're engaging upstream to minimize your impacts. The fourth, is that whatever commitment you make, whatever action plan you develop, and how you allocate your capital should be adapted to your company's materiality. And like I said, no two companies, their commitments, their targets are not going to look the same, because it really depends. So which things you should address first? Is it water consumption, pollutant loading, land use change? That depends on your sector. And then that also depends on what you've already done to address these impacts. I think it's worth noting that this nature positive approach is moving very quickly and much faster than the climate strategy space, from a voluntary initiative to a license to do business. We're seeing increasing pressure from investors and regulatory authorities under the CSRD in the EU, for example. You'll need to disclose this. You'll need to show how you're addressing it. And the last point, and this is a really important one, there's a shift that I'm seeing from doing it now to doing it well. And what I mean by that is that nobody really cares to see we are nature positive by 2024. We're nature positive next year. We're already nature positive. It's okay for you to set 2030, 2040, 2050 targets. And it's okay to be honest and transparent about where you are in your nature positive journey. What investors care about is that you're honest and transparent, and they want to see that your ambition is tempered by realism and feasibility. So it's more important to be able to say we understand our materiality than to say we're nature positive tomorrow. That's a key point. I think that's it. I'm sure that I went over time, but Sophia and Sylvia did not stop me. And so I assume it